I'm Cassandra. At my college graduation ceremony, my mother slapped me across the face in front of 3,000 people because I thanked my husband in my valedictorian speech instead of her. The sting burned less than her words. Ungrateful brat, after everything I sacrificed? But when she raised her hand to hit me again, my husband, Admiral James Whitfield, stepped between us and said in his command voice, "Touch my wife again, I dare you." Security footage went viral within hours. By the end of the week, my mother's entire social media empire had crumbled, and she was facing charges for assaulting a military officer's spouse on federal property. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like a fairy tale. Sunshine streamed through the tall windows of my apartment in Newport Harbor, Rhode Island, casting golden rectangles across my cap and gown, hanging carefully on the closet door. After 4 years of pre-med studies, countless sleepless nights, and maintaining a perfect 4.0 GPA while working 2 jobs, this was my moment. Valedictorian. Full scholarship to Johns Hopkins Medical School. Everything I'd worked for since I was 12 years old and decided I wanted to save lives. James was already up, pressed and perfect in his navy whites, the gold stripes on his sleeves catching the morning light. Admiral James Whitfield, my husband of 2 years, my anchor, my safe harbor in every storm life had thrown at me. He'd taken leave specifically for this day, flying in from his deployment in the Pacific just to watch me walk across that stage. "You nervous, Dr. Cassandra?" he teased, using the title I'd earn officially in a few hours. His smile was the kind that made me forget about everything else. The stress, the pressure, the constant weight of expectations that had followed me my entire life. About the speech, maybe, I admitted, smoothing down the emerald green honor cords that marked my academic achievements. But not about graduation. I've earned this. He wrapped his arms around me, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Until my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Remember what we discussed about your speech. You know who made all this possible." My stomach dropped. For weeks, my mother, Diane Castellano, had been obsessing over my valedictorian address, dropping not-so-subtle hints about what I should say, who I should thank, how I should present our family story. She'd built her entire identity around being the single mother who sacrificed everything for her brilliant daughter. Her social media presence, over 200,000 followers on Instagram, and a side business selling motivational courses to other parents, all centered around this narrative. The problem was, it wasn't entirely true. Yes, my father left when I was 8. Yes, she worked hard. But she also spent my childhood tournament money on designer handbags, my college fund on a kitchen renovation, and my teenage years reminding me daily that I owed her everything. When I met James during my sophomore year, when this incredible man saw something worth loving in the anxious, driven girl who never felt good enough, my mother's reaction wasn't joy. It was rage. "She's taking you away from your purpose," she'd hissed during one particularly brutal phone call. But James didn't take me away from my dreams. He supported them. When I couldn't afford organic chemistry textbooks, he bought them. When I had panic attacks during finals week, he held me while I cried. When I got the acceptance letter from Johns Hopkins, he picked me up and spun me around our tiny apartment kitchen, whooping loud enough for the neighbors to complain. The graduation ceremony was held at Newport University's massive outdoor amphitheater, carved into the hillside overlooking the harbor. 3,000 guests filled the white folding chairs arranged in perfect rows, and I could see my mother in the VIP family section, her coral pink dress and matching hat making her impossible to miss. She was already filming with her phone, no doubt planning to post about this moment before I even finished speaking. James was sitting 2 seats away from her, looking uncomfortable but polite in the way military officers master early in their careers. I'd asked him to try, for my sake, to get along with her for just this one day. The ceremony proceeded exactly as rehearsed. Name after name was called, students walked across the stage, families cheered. But my hands were shaking as I waited for my moment. When Dean Morrison announced, "And now, our valedictorian, Cassandra Whitfield," The applause was thunderous. I walked to the podium on unsteady legs, looking out at a sea of faces, knowing my words were being live-streamed to thousands more. I'd practiced the speech 100 times, but standing there under the bright June sun, I felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me. I talked about perseverance, about the importance of education, about following your dreams, even when the path seems impossible. But when I got to the acknowledgement section, the part my mother had been coaching me on for weeks, something inside me rebelled.
"I want to thank the people who made this possible," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. My professors who pushed me to be better, my classmates who became my second family, and most of all, my husband James, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, who supported my dreams even when they meant sacrifice, and who showed me that love isn't about debt or obligation, it's about partnership. The applause was warm and genuine. James was beaming, his pride visible even from the podium, but in my peripheral vision I could see my mother's face changing, the camera phone lowering, her expression shifting from pride to something much darker. I finished my speech to a standing ovation and walked back to my seat, graduation cap slightly askew, heart pounding with adrenaline and relief. I'd done it. I'd spoken my truth. That's when my mother stormed onto the stage. To understand what happened next, you need to know who my mother really was. Diane Castellano wasn't just any frustrated parent having a public meltdown. She was Newport Harbor's most successful mommy blogger, a woman who had built a $250,000-a-year empire selling the fantasy of perfect motherhood to desperate parents across the country. Her Instagram account, @RaisingBrilliance, had 847,000 followers who hung on every word of her carefully curated posts about sacrifice, dedication, and molding gifted children. Her blog attracted millions of monthly visitors, seeking her proven methods for raising academic superstars. She sold online courses for $2,997 each, promising parents they could replicate her success with their own children. Her book, The Brilliant Child Blueprint, had been on the New York Times bestseller list for 18 weeks. And it was all built on a lie. The version of our story she told the world was beautiful, inspiring, and completely fabricated. According to Diane Castellano's public narrative, she was a single mother who worked 3 jobs to pay for my tutoring, who drove me to academic competitions in a beat-up Honda while wearing the same dress to every school function because she spent every spare dollar on my education. She painted herself as the selfless martyr who gave up everything, her career, her social life, her own dreams, to create a prodigy. Her followers ate it up. Comments flooded in daily. "You're such an inspiration. I wish I had your dedication. Cassandra is so lucky to have you." She'd screenshot the most glowing praise and share it to her stories, basking in the adoration of strangers who saw her as the ultimate mother. The reality was far different. Yes, my father left when I was 8, but Diane didn't work 3 jobs. She worked part-time at a dental office while collecting alimony and child support. The tutoring she claimed to sacrifice for? I earned it myself through academic scholarships and my tutoring younger students. The academic competitions? I begged rides from other parents because she was usually too busy with her blog to drive me. When I won the state science fair at 15, she posted dozens of photos of herself crying proud tears, writing a 1,000-word essay about her journey as a mother. She sold that post as sponsored content to 3 different companies and made more money from my achievement than I received in scholarship funds. When I graduated high school as valedictorian with a full ride to Newport University, she launched her first paid course. When I maintained my 4.0 through pre-med, she wrote her book. Every milestone of my academic career became content for her empire, proof of her superior parenting methods. But there was one problem with her perfect story. James. My mother's brand was built on the idea that she was the only person responsible for my success. A devoted husband who actually supported my dreams? That didn't fit the narrative. According to the Diane Castellano mythology, Successful children came from single mothers who sacrificed everything, not from loving partnerships where spouses built each other up. When James and I got engaged during my junior year, she tried to convince me to postpone the wedding until after medical school. When we got married anyway, she cropped him out of all the photos she posted. When he got promoted to Admiral, she never mentioned it. In her world, I was still the brilliant daughter who owed everything to her sacrificial mother. She'd spent months planning how my valedictorian speech would fit into her brand. She'd already written promotional posts about it, scheduled interviews with parenting podcasts, and planned a course launch around Raising Valedictorians, the Final Chapter. My graduation was supposed to be her crowning moment, the ultimate proof that her methods worked. She'd coached me obsessively on what to say. I was supposed to thank her for her sacrifices, acknowledge her sleepless nights, credit her dedication for my success. She had even suggested specific phrases. None of this would have been possible without my mother's unwavering commitment, and she gave up everything so I could have everything. Instead, I'd thanked my husband. I'd talked about partnership instead of sacrifice. I'd given credit to the man who loved me for who I was, not the woman who saw me as a product of her superior parenting.
In front of 3,000 people and a live stream audience of thousands more, I had shattered the foundation of her empire. Newport University's amphitheater fell silent as my mother climbed the steps to the stage, her coral pink heels clicking against the wooden platform with sharp, angry precision. Dean Morrison started to move toward her, but she was already striding across the stage toward me, her face twisted with a rage I'd seen before, but never in public. The cameras that had been focused on the graduates swiveled to follow her, audience members lifting their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. This was the woman who preached patience and emotional regulation to hundreds of thousands of followers, who sold courses on maintaining composure under pressure. But in that moment, faced with the complete destruction of her carefully crafted image, Diane Castellano forgot about her brand entirely. She forgot about the cameras rolling, the audience watching, the live stream broadcasting her every move to the internet. All she could see was her ungrateful daughter who had just ruined everything she'd built over the past decade. "How dare you?" she hissed as she approached me, her voice carrying across the silent amphitheater through the podium microphone that was still live. "How dare you humiliate me like this, after everything I've given you?" I stood frozen in my cap and gown, clutching my diploma, as my mother raised her hand in front of 3,000 people and brought it down hard across my face. The slap echoed through the amphitheater like a gunshot. The silence that followed was deafening. 3,000 people held their breath as my cheek burned with the sting of my mother's palm. I could taste blood where my teeth had caught my inner lip, feel the heat spreading across my face like fire. The cap had been knocked askew on my head, my carefully pinned hair falling loose around my shoulders. For a moment that felt like eternity, nobody moved. The livestream cameras captured everything: my shocked expression, my mother's twisted face of rage, the sea of horrified spectators. Dean Morrison stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his mouth hanging open. The other faculty members looked like they were watching a car accident in slow motion. My mother wasn't finished. Her chest was heaving, her perfectly applied makeup starting to streak with perspiration and fury. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat. After everything I sacrificed for you, I gave up my entire life, worked my fingers to the bone, went without so you could have everything, and this is how you repay me?" She raised her hand again, and that's when time snapped back into motion. James moved faster than I'd ever seen him move, even during emergency drills on his ship. In 3 long strides, he was between my mother and me, his 6'2" frame creating a wall of navy dress whites and barely contained fury. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding nuclear submarines and 1,000-person crews. "Ma'am, step back. Now." But my mother was beyond reason, beyond recognizing the danger she was in. She tried to push past him, her manicured nails clawing at his uniform. "Get out of my way. This is between me and my daughter." "Your daughter is my wife.
James said, his voice dropping to that deadly calm tone I'd only heard him use once before, during a family dinner when my uncle made a racist comment. And you just assaulted her in front of 3,000 witnesses on federal property. Step back. The words federal property seemed to cut through the crowd's shock like a blade. Newport University received federal funding, making the campus technically federal land. Assaulting anyone here was a federal offense. Assaulting the spouse of a military officer made it exponentially worse. My mother either didn't understand or didn't care. Don't you dare threaten me, you controlling piece of... Touch my wife again, James interrupted, his voice carrying across the amphitheater with crystal clarity. I dare you. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a warning. It was a promise, delivered with the kind of absolute authority that comes from years of life and death command decisions. Every person in that amphitheater understood they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond a family argument. My mother's hand was still raised, still poised to strike again when campus security finally reached the stage, but she was looking at James now, really looking at him for the first time. The gold eagles on his shoulders, the rows of ribbons on his chest, the way he stood like an immovable force between her and her target. Admiral James Whitfield wasn't just my supportive husband anymore. He was a decorated military officer who had just watched someone assault his spouse on federal property. And everyone in that amphitheater suddenly understood the gravity of what had just happened. My mother was not finished. Her chest was heaving, her perfectly applied makeup starting to streak with perspiration and fury. You selfish, ungrateful little brat, after everything I sacrificed for you, I gave up my entire life, worked my fingers to the bone, went without so you could have everything, and this is how you repay me?
That's when the phones came out en masse. What had started as scattered recording became a wave of devices pointed at the stage. Someone in the back shouted, "World Star!" Another voice called out, "This is going straight to TikTok." My mother seemed to notice the cameras for the first time, her influencer instincts finally kicking in through her rage. She looked around at the forest of phones recording her meltdown, at the horrified faces of parents and grandparents, at the livestream cameras that had captured every second of her public breakdown. "Turn those cameras off!" she shrieked, lunging toward the nearest phone. "Stop recording! This is private!" But it was too late. The damage was done. Diane Castellano, the woman who had built her empire on controlled, curated content about perfect parenting, had just had the most imperfect parenting moment possible broadcast to the world. Security officers flanked her now, speaking in low professional tones about cooperation and coming quietly. James kept his position between her and me, his hand resting protectively on my back. I could feel him trembling with controlled anger, every muscle in his body coiled tight. "Cassandra," my mother called out as they guided her toward the stage steps, her voice suddenly desperate, pleading. "Cassandra, tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them I was just emotional. Tell them—" "No," I said quietly, but the podium microphone picked it up, carried my single word across the silent amphitheater. It was the first thing I had said since she'd hit me, and it rang with finality. My mother's face crumpled, not with remorse, but with the realization that her perfectly constructed world was collapsing in real time. As security escorted her off the stage, she looked back one more time, and I saw something that chilled me more than her anger had. She wasn't looking at me with regret or love or even fury. She was looking at me like I had betrayed her brand, damaged her product, destroyed her investment. Even in her moment of complete downfall, I was still just content to her. The amphitheater remained eerily quiet as she disappeared from view. Dean Morrison approached the podium with shaking hands, attempting to restore some semblance of dignity to the ceremony. But everyone knew this graduation would be remembered for one thing only. James pulled me against him, and I finally let myself shake, let the adrenaline and shock catch up with me. My face still burned where she'd struck me,
But worse was the hollow ache in my chest where 22 years of hoping for her love had just died. "It's over," James murmured against my hair, so quiet only I could hear. "Whatever hold she had on you, it's over now." But as I looked out at the sea of phones still recording, at the faces of strangers who had just watched my family implode, I knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The ride home was a blur of flashing police lights and concerned voices. Campus security had detained my mother in their holding facility while they waited for Newport Harbor police to arrive and process what they were calling an incident involving assault on federal property. James drove in silence, his jaw still clenched, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every few minutes, he'd glance over at me, checking the ice pack I held against my swollen cheek. Our apartment felt different when we walked through the door. The morning's joy, my cap and gown hung carefully in the closet, the champagne bottle we had planned to open, the congratulatory flowers from James's crew, all of it felt like artifacts from another lifetime. I set my diploma on the kitchen counter and stared at it. This piece of paper I'd worked 4 years to earn, now overshadowed by a single moment of public humiliation. My phone had been buzzing nonstop during the drive. I'd turned off the notifications after the first dozen dings, but I could see the screen lighting up every few seconds like a strobe light. James noticed too. "Maybe you should turn it off completely," he suggested gently, loosening his tie and hanging up his dress jacket. Even in crisis mode, his military training showed everything in its proper place. But I couldn't stop myself from looking. The first thing I saw was a text from my college roommate, Riley. "Oh my God, Kaz, are you okay? The video is everywhere." Video. Plural videos. I scrolled through my notifications with growing horror. Tagged mentions on Instagram, Twitter notifications, Facebook messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. My heart hammered as I realized the scope of what had just happened. Someone had already posted the footage to TikTok with the caption, "Crazy mom attacks daughter at graduation." It had 50,000 views and climbing. Another angle appeared on Twitter. "Watch, mommy blogger Diane Castellano loses it at daughter's graduation." That one had been retweeted 500 times in the past hour. But the worst was Instagram. Someone had filmed vertically and posted it as a story, tagged with my mother's handle, @RaisingBrilliance. Her comments section was exploding. The carefully curated world of supportive followers and inspirational quotes had transformed into a battlefield of shocked reactions and harsh judgment. This is not the Diane we know and love. How could you hit your daughter on her graduation day? Unfollowing immediately. This is disgusting behavior. And she teaches parenting classes? Yikes!
I kept scrolling, unable to stop, watching my mother's perfect image crumble in real time. Her most recent post, from this morning, was a photo of her getting ready for my graduation with the caption, "Today my baby girl becomes Dr. Cassandra. So proud of the young woman I raised. #ProudMom. #RaisingBrilliance. #graduation day." The comments under that post had shifted dramatically. What had started as congratulations and heart eye emojis had transformed into a stream of criticism and disbelief. This aged like milk. Imagine being this delusional about your parenting. Your baby girl deserves better than you. The audacity to post this and then assault her hours later? My hands shook as I kept reading. James sat down beside me on the couch, gently taking the phone from my fingers. "Hey," he said softly, "stop torturing yourself with this." "I can't stop," I whispered, my voice cracking. "James, this is everywhere. Everyone's going to see this. My future colleagues, medical school classmates, patients someday." The reality of it hit me like a wave. My mother just destroyed both our reputations in front of the entire world. The apartment phone rang, our landline that only got spam calls and contact from James's command. We both looked at it in confusion until James picked up. "Admiral Whitfield?" "Yes, I understand." "No, my wife is fine, thank you." "Yes, sir, I'll be available if needed." He hung up and rubbed his temples.
That was base command. Apparently, someone recognized my uniform in the videos and reported the incident up the chain. They wanted to make sure I wasn't planning any unofficial response to what happened. The military implications hit me then. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. When you assault the spouse of a military officer, especially on federal property, it becomes a matter of national security interest. They were worried James might take matters into his own hands. What did you tell them? That I'm letting the civilian authorities handle it through proper channels. He paused, his expression darkening. But that doesn't mean I'm not furious, Cass. I've never wanted to break protocol more in my life. As if summoned by his words, there was a knock at our door. James looked through the peephole and sighed. Police. 2 officers stood in our hallway, notebooks out, expressions professionally neutral. Detective Rivera introduced herself and her partner, explaining they needed to take a formal statement about the incident. They were kind but thorough, asking me to describe exactly what happened, how I felt, whether I wanted to press charges. The video evidence is pretty cut and dry, but we need your formal statement to proceed. This is assault and battery committed on federal property witnessed by thousands. The district attorney's office is taking this very seriously. The thought of my mother being prosecuted felt surreal. This morning, she was texting me about our celebratory dinner reservations. Now she was potentially facing criminal charges. What happens next? I asked. She'll be formally charged within 24 hours. Given the federal property aspect and the public nature of the incident, it's unlikely she'll be offered a simple plea deal. This is going to court. After the police left, I sat in our darkening living room, the weight of the day finally settling on me. My phone had continued buzzing, reporters trying to reach me, distant relatives asking if I was okay, former classmates wanting the real story. But the message that broke me came at 9 p.m. A text from my mother's phone. I hope you're satisfied. 20 years of building my business, my reputation, my life's work, gone because you couldn't show some gratitude. I'll never forgive you for this. I showed it to James, who immediately took a screenshot. Evidence, he explained. She's trying to blame you for the consequences of her own actions. But her words cut deep anyway, because part of me, the part that had spent 22 years trying to earn her love, wondered if she was right. If I had just thanked her in my speech like she wanted, none of this would have happened. James seemed to read my thoughts. Cassandra, you did nothing wrong. You gave an honest, heartfelt speech thanking the people who actually supported you. Her reaction to that is entirely on her. I wanted to believe him. But as I looked at my reflection in our darkened window, at the swelling on my cheek and the exhaustion in my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. My mother had spent decades building her empire on a carefully constructed narrative. I had just shattered that narrative in the most public way possible. And if I knew anything about Diane Castellano, it's that she never went down without a fight.
I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's twisted face, felt the sting of her palm, heard the echo of that slap reverberating through the amphitheater. James held me as I tossed and turned, his steady breathing a reminder that I wasn't alone in this nightmare. But my mind wouldn't quiet, cycling through years of memories I'd buried, moments I'd explained away, patterns I'd refused to see. At 4 a.m., I gave up on sleep and padded to the kitchen in my pajamas. The ice pack had long since melted, but my cheeks still throbbed with each heartbeat. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat at our small dining table, staring at my phone. The notification count had climbed to over 300. 300 people trying to reach me, most of them strangers hungry for details about my family's public destruction. That's when I found the email that changed everything. It was buried between interview requests from gossip blogs and sympathy messages from distant relatives. The sender's name was Dr. Evelyn Martinez, and the subject line read, "From one survivor to another." I almost deleted it, another stranger with opinions about my situation. But something made me open it. "Dear Cassandra," it began, "you don't know me,
but I've been watching the coverage of what happened at your graduation, and I feel compelled to reach out. I'm a trauma therapist specializing in narcissistic abuse, and I'm also a daughter who survived a mother very much like yours. 30 years ago, my mother ruined my wedding day in front of 200 guests because my vows didn't credit her enough for my happiness. She threw a wine glass at my new husband and screamed that I was an ungrateful brat who owed her everything. There were no cell phones then, no social media to broadcast her meltdown, but the humiliation felt just as complete. I want you to know something that took me years to understand. What happened to you wasn't about a graduation speech, it was about control. Your mother didn't lose her temper, she weaponized it to punish you for stepping outside the role she assigned you. If you'd like to talk to someone who understands, I'm in Newport Harbor. My practice is at Harbor View Wellness Center. Sometimes it helps to speak with someone who's walked the same path. I read the email 3 times, my coffee growing cold in my hands. Dr. Martinez had attached her credentials: PhD in clinical psychology, specialist certification in narcissistic abuse recovery, author of 2 books I'd never heard of but suddenly needed to read immediately. But it was her personal story that hit me like a revelation. Another daughter, another public humiliation, another mother who saw her child's independence as a personal attack. I wasn't alone in this. I wasn't the first person to have a mother who built an empire on lies and maintained it through emotional terrorism. James found me crying over my laptop at 6 a.m. Dr. Martinez's email still open on the screen. "Who's this?" he asked gently, wrapping his arms around my shoulders from behind. "A therapist. She says her mother did something similar to her 30 years ago." I leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his warmth. "James, what if this isn't about me being ungrateful? What if there's actually something wrong with my mother?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Cassandra, I've been trying to tell you that for 2 years. Your mother's behavior toward you, it's not normal. The way she takes credit for everything good in your life but blames you for anything that threatens her image, that's not how healthy parents act." I turned in my chair to look at him. "Then why didn't I see it?" "Because you were raised in it. It was your normal." His expression softened. "Do you want to call this Dr. Martinez?" I did call her. That afternoon, I sat in her office overlooking Newport Harbor. The same water I could see from our apartment that's somehow looking completely different from this angle. Dr. Martinez was in her 50s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that made you want to tell her everything. "Tell me about your earliest memory of disappointing your mother," she asked after I had recounted yesterday's events. The memory came back instantly, sharp as broken glass. I was 7 years old, had won first place in a school spelling bee. I ran home excited to tell my mother, but she was on the phone with a friend, complaining about my father's latest disappearing act. When I interrupted to share my news, she covered the phone and hissed, "Can't you see I'm dealing with real problems? Your little contests don't fix anything." She made me feel guilty for being excited about something good, like my happiness was selfish when she was suffering. And how did that pattern continue as you got older? The floodgates opened. Story after story poured out of me. How my mother would build me up in public, but tear me down in private. How she'd brag about my achievements to her friends, but tell me, "I'm getting too big for my britches." How she'd demand gratitude for sacrifices I'd never asked her to make, then use my guilt to control my choices.
When I got into Harvard for undergrad, she cried for 3 days about how I was abandoning her, I said. She made me feel so guilty that I turned it down and stayed local for Newport University instead. Dr. Martinez nodded knowingly. Classic narcissistic parenting. You were raised to be her emotional support system, her source of validation, her proof that she was a good person. When you started developing your own identity, especially one that included James as a support figure, you threatened that dynamic. She pulled a book from her shelf and handed it to me, Adult Children of Narcissists by Dr. Nina Brown. I want you to read chapter 3 tonight. It's about enmeshment and the process of healthy separation. As our session ended, Dr. Martinez said something that rewrote my entire understanding of my relationship with my mother. Cassandra, yesterday when your mother hit you, she wasn't having an emotional breakdown. She was enforcing a boundary she'd established years ago, that you exist for her benefit, not your own. Your speech threatened that arrangement, so she escalated to physical violence to reassert control. The fact that she did it publicly shows how desperate she was to maintain her narrative, even at the cost of destroying both your reputations. That evening, I sat on our couch with James, the book open in my lap, reading passages aloud that described my entire childhood with clinical precision. The chapter on emotional incest, where a parent treats their child like a surrogate spouse or therapist, could have been written about my relationship with my mother. "Listen to this," I said, my voice shaking. "The narcissistic parent views their child's achievements as proof of their superior parenting, but any independence or outside relationships are seen as a betrayal. The child learns to suppress their own needs and desires to maintain the parent's emotional stability." James was quiet, processing. Finally, he said, "So when you thanked me instead of her, I chose my husband over my mother. I chose the person who actually supports me over the person who claims ownership of me." The clarity was devastating and liberating at the same time. She didn't hit me because she was emotional, James. She hit me because I stepped out of line. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I wrote a list of every time my mother had manipulated, guilt-tripped, or emotionally abused me. The list filled 4 pages. 4 pages of incidents I'd minimized, excused, or forgotten entirely. But I also wrote something else. A list of everyone who had actually supported my dreams. James topped the list, but there were others. Professor Chen, who'd recommended me for research positions. My study group, who had celebrated every milestone with me. Riley, my roommate, who'd brought me coffee during all-nighters. For the first time in my life, I saw clearly that my mother wasn't the source of my success. I was the obstacle I'd succeeded despite. I called Dr. Martinez that night. "I want to understand everything," I told her. "I want to know how she did this to me, and I want to know how to make sure she never does it again." "Recovery isn't about getting revenge, Cassandra," she warned gently. "It's about reclaiming your life." "Then that's what I want to do. I want my life back." But first, I had to understand exactly what I was fighting against, and as I would soon discover, my mother's manipulation went far deeper than public humiliation. She had been systematically destroying my sense of self for decades, and yesterday's slap was just the moment when her mask finally slipped. The real battle for my freedom was just beginning. 3 days after my graduation, the first legal document arrived by certified mail. I signed for it with hands that had finally stopped shaking, but my newfound clarity evaporated the moment I read the header. Costello versus Whitfield. Defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. My mother was suing me. James found me standing in our kitchen, the papers scattered across the counter, my face white with shock. "She's claiming I orchestrated the whole thing," I whispered, reading from the complaint. "That I deliberately provoked her at graduation to make her look bad and damage her business. She's saying I've been planning this for months to destroy her reputation out of jealousy." The lawsuit was 37 pages of creative fiction. According to my mother's attorney, I was a manipulative daughter who had systematically undermined her mother's successful business through a campaign of lies and staged incidents. The graduation slap wasn't assault, it was a momentary emotional response to deliberate provocation by a vindictive child seeking attention and financial gain. They were asking for $2.3 million in damages for lost business income, emotional distress, and defamation of character. "This is insane," James said, reading over my shoulder. "She hit you in front of 3,000 people, on camera. How is she blaming to be the victim here?" But I was already seeing the strategy. My mother had spent the past 3 days crafting a counter-narrative with the help of what looked like a very expensive legal team. She'd turned herself into the wronged party, the devoted mother driven to momentary despair by her daughter's calculated cruelty. My phone rang.
Dr. Martinez. Cassandra, I saw the news about the lawsuit. Are you okay?
I wasn't okay. I was discovering that my mother's manipulation had layers I'd never imagined. She's claiming I set her up, Dr. Martinez, that everything at graduation was planned to make her look bad. This is called DARVO, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It's a classic narcissistic abuse tactic. When they're caught in an inexcusable behavior, they flip the script and make themselves the victim. Her voice was calm, professional. Don't let her rewrite history, Cassandra. You know what happened. But knowing what happened and proving it in court were different things. The lawsuit had been filed in a way that painted my mother as a successful businesswoman destroyed by her daughter's jealous lies. She'd included screenshots of her declining follower count, canceled business partnerships, and messages from people calling her an abusive parent. All evidence of the damage caused by her own actions, but presented as proof of my malicious intent. That evening, James and I sat across from attorney Rebecca Walsh in her downtown Newport Harbor office. Walsh specialized in defamation defense and had agreed to take our case after reviewing the viral videos. "This lawsuit is frivolous," Walsh said grimly, flipping through the complaint. "But frivolous doesn't mean harmless. Your mother has hired Brennan and Associates. They're expensive, aggressive, and they specialize in reputation management for wealthy clients. They're going to try to bury you in legal fees and bad publicity." She pulled out a thick folder. "I've been doing research on your mother's business practices. Diane Castellano has been very careful over the years to control her narrative, but there are cracks in the foundation. Refund requests from course buyers, complaints to the Better Business Bureau, former business partners who felt cheated. She's built her empire on manufactured success stories and false testimonials." This was news to me. "What do you mean, false testimonials?" "I found 12 different accounts of parents who claim your mother's methods helped their children achieve academic success. But when I contacted them, half denied ever working with her, and the others said their children's achievements had nothing to do with her programs. She's been creating fake success stories to sell her courses. My mother wasn't just an abusive parent. She was a fraud." But the lawsuit wasn't her only weapon. 2 days later, I discovered she'd launched a full-scale media campaign to rehabilitate her image. She'd hired a crisis management firm and was giving interviews to anyone who would listen. "Parenting expert speaks out. My daughter's cruel manipulation nearly destroyed me," read the headline in the Newport Harbor Gazette. The article featured a photo of my mother looking devastated and vulnerable. Nothing like the rage-filled woman who'd slapped me on stage. In the interview, she presented herself as a loving mother driven to desperation by years of emotional abuse from her ungrateful daughter. She claimed I had been acting out since my marriage, jealous of her success, determined to destroy everything she'd built. "I gave Cassandra everything," she was quoted as saying. "I sacrificed my own dreams to support hers, and she repaid me by publicly humiliating me at what should have been our proudest moment." The slap was wrong, but I was pushed beyond my breaking point by months of psychological warfare. Psychological warfare. She was accusing me of exactly what she'd been doing to me my entire life. The interview had been carefully crafted to make her sound rational and wounded rather than abusive. She acknowledged that hitting me was wrong, but framed it as an understandable response to sustained provocation. She painted herself as the real victim of a calculated attack on her reputation and livelihood. James was furious. "She's lying about everything. Anyone who knows you would see through this." But that was the problem. Most people didn't know me. They knew my mother's version of me, the image she'd crafted through years of carefully curated social media posts. In her narrative, I was the ungrateful daughter who'd always been difficult, who'd married young to escape responsibility, who'd grown jealous of her mother's success. The interview had dozens of her loyal followers. "I always wondered about that daughter. She seemed ungrateful in those family posts. Diane is such a strong woman. I can't imagine what she's been through. Some children just turn on their parents no matter what you do for them." My mother had successfully weaponized her platform against me. She was using the same audience manipulation skills that had built her empire to destroy my credibility before I could fight back. Dr. Martinez helped me understand what I was facing. Your mother is in full narcissistic rage mode, she explained during our emergency session. When narcissists are exposed publicly, they don't seek reconciliation or try to make amends. They go nuclear. They'll spend every resource they have to avoid accountability. But she hit me on camera. How can she spin that? By making it about everything except what she did. She'll claim you drove her to it, that you're the real abuser, that she's the victim of a smear campaign. She'll use every manipulation tactic she's ever learned to avoid facing consequences. The worst part was discovering how deep her manipulation went. Attorney Walsh had uncovered evidence that my mother had been secretly controlling aspects of my life I thought were my own choices. The partial scholarship that helped me afford Newport University. She'd convinced my father to withdraw his support by telling him I was becoming too independent and needed to learn responsibility.
The job opportunities I'd lost during college? She'd contacted potential employers, claiming concern about my emotional stability and suggesting they might want to reconsider hiring someone from such a troubled family situation. My mother hadn't just been taking credit for my successes. She'd been actively sabotaging my independence to keep me dependent on her approval and support. She's been grooming you for this your entire life, Dr. Martinez said, creating situations where you needed her, then taking credit for helping you through problems she created. As I sat in our apartment that night, surrounded by legal documents and media clippings of my mother's lies, I realized this wasn't just about a slap at graduation anymore. This was about 22 years of systematic psychological abuse finally being exposed, and my mother's desperate attempt to maintain control by destroying me completely. She had made one critical mistake, though. In her fury to avoid consequences, she had overplayed her hand. The lawsuit, the media campaign, the manufactured victim narrative, it was all too much, too desperate, too transparent. And I was no longer the terrified child who would accept her version of reality without question. I was ready to fight back. The war room we created in our dining room would have impressed any military strategist. Attorney Walsh had delivered 3 boxes of discovery materials, and our small table groaned under the weight of financial records, business documents, email printouts, and legal briefs. James approached it with the same methodical precision he used for naval operations, creating color-coded filing systems and timeline charts that mapped out every aspect of my mother's deception. We're not just defending against her lawsuit, Attorney Walsh explained during our strategy session. We're building a counteroffensive that exposes the entire foundation of lies she's built her empire on. The deeper we dug, the more disturbing the picture became. My mother's business practices weren't just unethical, they were potentially criminal. Walsh's investigative team had uncovered a pattern of fraud spanning 5 years. Fake testimonials, manipulated before and after photos of transformed families, and course materials plagiarized from legitimate child development experts. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez had connected me with 3 other women whose mothers exhibited similar patterns of narcissistic abuse. During a support group session, one of them, Amanda Preston, mentioned that her mother had purchased one of Diane Castellano's premium coaching packages for $8,000. She was desperate to turn me into some kind of prodigy, like your mom claimed you were, Amanda told me over coffee. But when the methods didn't work and I asked for a refund, your mother told her that some children were just too damaged by previous parenting mistakes to be helped. Amanda's mother had recordings of those coaching calls. Hours of audio where my mother berated a grieving woman whose daughter was struggling with depression,
claiming the child's mental health issues were the result of maternal failures that could only be fixed through more expensive interventions. She told my mom that if she really loved me, she'd find a way to pay for the advanced program, Amanda said, her voice shaking with anger. This was right after my dad died, when we could barely afford groceries. Your mother was literally profiting off our family's trauma. Walsh was ecstatic when I brought her the recordings. This demonstrates a clear pattern of predatory business practices. Combined with the fake testimonials and plagiarized content, we can prove she's been running a sophisticated fraud operation. But building our case wasn't just about gathering evidence. Dr. Martinez insisted that my own healing had to be part of the strategy. You can't fight her effectively if you're still operating from a place of trauma and guilt, she warned. She's going to try every manipulation tactic she's ever used on you, amplified by desperation. She was right. The guilt was the hardest part to overcome. Despite everything I'd learned about narcissistic abuse, part of me still felt responsible for destroying my mother's life. That little girl who'd spent 22 years trying to earn her love whispered that maybe I could have handled the graduation speech differently. Maybe I could have prevented all of this. Dr. Martinez gave me homework assignments that felt strange at first, but gradually began to shift my perspective. I had to write letters to my childhood self, acknowledging the impossible position I've been put in. I had to practice saying, "That's not my responsibility," in the mirror until I could say it without my voice shaking. Most importantly, she helped me understand that my mother's current behavior actually providing evidence of her true nature. A genuinely remorseful parent would have apologized after slapping their child at graduation. They would have sought therapy, tried to make amends, shown concern for the damage they'd caused. Instead, my mother doubled down, hired lawyers, and launched a media campaign to avoid accountability. Her actions are proving everything you've told me about her. Meanwhile, James was conducting his own form of reconnaissance. His military background had taught him the importance of understanding your opponent's resources and strategies. He'd been monitoring my mother's social media accounts, tracking her public statements, and documenting every contradiction in her narrative. "She's making mistakes," he reported during one of our strategy sessions. "Her story keeps changing. In the first interview, she said you'd been acting out for months. In the second one, she claimed this came out of nowhere and she was completely blindsided. She can't keep her lies straight."
He'd also been reaching out to his contacts in military law enforcement. The federal property aspect of the assault was still being investigated, and James had made sure the appropriate authorities understood the full context of what had happened. "Admiral Richardson from Base Command called me yesterday," he told Walsh during our next meeting. "They've been following the case because of the federal jurisdiction issues. He mentioned that military spouses have certain protections under federal law that might be relevant here." Walsh's eyes lit up. "I hadn't considered that angle. Let me research the Military Spouse Protection Act provisions." But perhaps the most powerful weapon in our arsenal came from an unexpected source: my mother's own followers. The viral graduation videos had reached far beyond Newport Harbor, and people who had purchased her courses or followed her advice were starting to speak out. A Facebook group called Diane Castellano Victims had formed organically, with over 300 members sharing their experiences with my mother's predatory business practices. Parents who had spent thousands on her programs, only to be blamed when the methods didn't work. Families who had been emotionally manipulated into purchasing additional services they couldn't afford. Most damaging of all were the screenshots of private messages my mother had sent to customers who requested refunds. The compassionate, understanding public persona disappeared completely in these private communications, replaced by someone who was cruel, dismissive, and threatening. "You're clearly not committed enough to your child's success," she had written to one mother struggling with a learning disabled son. "Some parents just aren't capable of the level of dedication real transformation requires." To another family dealing with financial hardship,
If you can't afford to invest in your child's future, perhaps you shouldn't have had children. Success requires sacrifice that weak parents aren't willing to make. The private messages revealed the same contempt and manipulation she had used on me extended to hundreds of vulnerable families seeking help. Walsh worked with the Facebook group administrators to collect testimonials and evidence for our countersuit. We weren't just defending against defamation anymore. We were preparing to file our own lawsuit against my mother for fraudulent business practices and consumer fraud. The beauty of this approach, Walsh explained, is that it shifts the narrative completely. Instead of it being about a family dispute, this becomes about a predatory business owner who abused her customers' trust. The graduation incident becomes evidence of her true character, not the focus of the case. As we prepared for the depositions that would begin next week, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: confidence in my own version of reality. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was clear. My mother's desperate attempts to avoid accountability had actually provided us with everything we needed to expose her completely. But I knew the hardest part was still coming. Sitting across from my mother in a conference room, listening to her lies under oath, watching her try to manipulate the legal system the same way she had manipulated me for decades. Dr. Martinez had been preparing me for this confrontation, helping me practice staying grounded in truth when my mother inevitably tried to gaslight me in front of attorneys and court reporters. Remember, she had told me during our last session, you're not that powerless child anymore. You have allies, evidence, and most importantly, you know who you really are. She can't rewrite your reality if you refuse to let her. The night before the depositions began, James and I sat on our couch reviewing our final preparations. The dining room table was cleared and organized, every piece of evidence properly labeled and filed. We were as ready as we could be. "Are you nervous?" James asked. I considered the question honestly. Terrified, I admitted. But not of her anymore. I'm terrified of how much damage she's done to other families and how long she's been getting away with it. Tomorrow, we would begin the process of holding Diane Castellano accountable not just for hitting her daughter at graduation, but for years of systematic fraud and abuse. Tomorrow, the woman who had built an empire on lies about perfect parenting would have to face the truth under oath. I was ready to watch her world crumble the same way she tried to destroy mine. The conference room at Brennan & Associates felt like a courtroom, complete with mahogany table, leather chairs, and an atmosphere thick with tension. My mother sat across from me for the first time since graduation, flanked by two expensive suits who'd been coaching her for weeks. She looked smaller than I remember, her usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of mounting evidence against her. But her eyes still held that familiar calculation, that predatory intelligence that had controlled me for 22 years. She was studying me, looking for weakness, planning her attack. Attorney Walsh sat beside me, our boxes of evidence stacked neatly on the table, like ammunition. James wasn't allowed in the room during depositions, but I could feel his support through the conference room glass walls, where he waited with Dr. Martinez. "Let's begin," said the court reporter, her fingers poised over the stenotype machine. "Please state your name for the record." "Diane Castellano," my mother said, her voice steady and composed. The performance had begun.
Walsh reached for another exhibit. "Let's talk about your business coaching calls with the Preston family. In this recording, you tell a grieving mother that her daughter's depression is her fault for not following your methods properly. Do you remember that conversation?" But my mother wasn't listening anymore. She was staring at me with pure hatred, all pretense of maternal love stripped away. "You planned this," she hissed. "All of it. The speech, the recordings, this lawsuit. You orchestrated everything to destroy me." "Miss Castellano," Walsh said calmly, "are you saying your daughter planned for you to hit her at graduation? She knew I would react. She knew exactly what buttons to push." The admission hung in the room like smoke. My mother had just confessed under oath that she'd hit me as a calculated punishment for not following her methods properly. Her attorney was frantically trying to end the deposition, but Walsh had one more exhibit. The Facebook group testimonials from over 300 families who had been financially and emotionally manipulated by my mother's predatory business practices. As Walsh read statement after statement from parents who had been exploited during their most vulnerable moments, I watched my mother's empire crumble in real time. Not through a viral video or social media backlash, but through the methodical presentation of evidence under oath. When the deposition finally ended 4 hours later, my mother's attorney immediately requested a recess to discuss settlement options. The case they'd planned to win with manufactured victim narratives had become an indefensible nightmare of documented fraud and admitted abuse. As we packed up our evidence, my mother made one last desperate attempt at control. She approached me as her attorneys huddled in urgent conversation. "Cassandra," she said, her voice returning to that familiar, manipulative sweetness, "we can fix this. We can make a deal. You drop your countersuit, I'll drop mine, and we can go back to being a family." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw her clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. Not a flawed but loving mother driven to desperation. Not a successful businesswoman protecting her reputation. Just a predator who had built her life on exploiting vulnerable people, starting with her own daughter. "No," I said quietly. "We were never a family, Diane. You were my abuser and I was your victim. But that's over now." I walked out of that conference room knowing that I had won more than a legal battle. I had won my freedom from a woman who had never seen me as anything more than a source of validation and income. The war was over. Now came the reckoning. 6 months later, I stood in the same Newport Harbor courthouse where my mother's deposition had taken place. But everything had changed. Today wasn't about depositions or legal maneuvering. Today was the final hearing where Judge Catherine Brennan would approve the settlement agreement that had taken 3 months to negotiate. My mother sat at the defendant's table, flanked by a new legal team. Her previous attorneys had quietly withdrawn after the deposition disaster. She looked nothing like the polished influencer who had built her empire on manufactured maternal perfection. Her business had collapsed within weeks of the deposition transcripts being filed. The Better Business Bureau investigation, triggered by our evidence, had resulted in a permanent ban on her operating any coaching or consulting services. Her social media accounts, once boasting nearly 1 million followers, had been deactivated after the flood of angry customers demanding refunds became unmanageable. The settlement was comprehensive. My mother would pay $1.8 million in restitution to the family she had defrauded, liquidating her properties and business assets to fund the payments. She faced 3 years of probation and mandatory psychological counseling. Most importantly for me, the settlement included a permanent restraining order. She was legally forbidden from contacting me, James, or any future children we might have. But perhaps the most satisfying element was the public apology she was required to post on all former business platforms, acknowledging her fraudulent practices and the harm she had caused to the families who trusted her. The woman who had built her career on controlling narratives was forced to let the truth speak for itself. Judge Brennan reviewed the settlement terms with methodical precision. "Ms. Castellano, do you understand that by accepting this agreement, you are admitting to fraudulent business practices and acknowledging that your assault of your daughter was unprovoked and unjustified?" My mother's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you understand that any violation of the restraining order or attempt to resume coaching or consulting services will result in immediate incarceration?" "Yes, Your Honor." When the judge's gavel fell, officially closing the case, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but peace. The war was over, but more importantly, the little girl inside me who had spent decades trying to earn her mother's love could finally rest. That love was never available because my mother was incapable of seeing me as anything more than an extension of herself. Dr. Martinez met me and James in the courthouse lobby. Over the past 6 months, she had become more than my therapist. She was the maternal figure I'd never had, someone who celebrated my achievements without taking credit and supported my growth without demanding gratitude. "How are you feeling?" she asked as we walked toward the parking garage. "Free," I said simply. It was the most honest answer I could give.
The ripple effects of our victory extended far beyond my personal healing. The Diane Castellano case, as it became known in legal circles, had exposed an entire industry of predatory parenting coaches who exploited vulnerable families. Attorney Walsh had been contacted by dozens of similar victims, leading to a class action lawsuit that would eventually result in new consumer protection regulations for the coaching industry. The Facebook support group that had started with 300 members had grown to over 2,000 people sharing their stories of recovery from narcissistic family abuse. Amanda Preston had started a nonprofit organization providing resources for adult children of narcissistic parents, using the legal strategies we'd developed as a template for others seeking justice. But perhaps the most unexpected development came 3 weeks after the settlement. I received a letter forwarded through Attorney Walsh's office, not from my mother, but from my father. David Whitmore had been following the case from his home in Seattle, where he'd rebuilt his life after leaving our family when I was 8. The man I'd been taught to see as an abandoning coward had actually been another victim of my mother's manipulation. "I tried to maintain a relationship with you after the divorce," he wrote, "but every time I called or sent letters, your mother would tell me you didn't want to hear from me. She convinced me that staying away was what was best for you. I believed her lies for 14 years, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." He included copies of child support payments, birthday cards I'd never received, and letters documenting his attempts to stay involved in my life, all blocked by my mother's interference. The narrative she'd constructed about my father abandoning us was as fabricated as everything else in her empire of lies. James found me crying over the letter at our kitchen table. "Good tears or bad tears?" he asked gently. "I don't know," I admitted. "I have a father who actually wanted to be in my life. She stole that from both of us." "But you can have it now," James pointed out, "if you want it." I did want it. 6 months later, James and I flew to Seattle to meet the father I'd been told didn't love me. David Whitmore was nothing like the monster my mother had described. He was a quiet, thoughtful man who ran a small bookstore and had spent 14 years wondering if his daughter was okay. A relationship would take time to rebuild, but we had something my mother had never given me: honest communication and respect for each other's boundaries. He didn't expect me to fill any emotional void in his life or prove his worth as a parent. He simply wanted to know me as the adult I had become. Meanwhile, my career continued to flourish in ways my mother's interference had previously prevented. Johns Hopkins Medical School welcomed me with full enthusiasm, and I discovered that my professors were impressed by my resilience and maturity. The graduation incident, rather than harming my reputation, had demonstrated my ability to handle crisis with grace and principle. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that survivors of narcissistic abuse often develop exceptional emotional intelligence and ethical reasoning because we've had to navigate complex manipulation from an early age. You've essentially had advanced training in recognizing deception and maintaining your integrity under pressure, she explained. Those are exactly the qualities that make excellent physicians. A year after graduation, James received orders for a new assignment in San Diego. As we packed up our Newport Harbor apartment, I found myself looking forward to the move in a way that would have been impossible before. I was no longer tied to this place by fear, obligation, or the desperate hope that my mother might someday become the person I needed her to be. The last item I packed was a photo from my graduation day. Not the official ceremony picture, but a candid shot James had taken afterward. I'm standing beside our car in my cap and gown, my cheeks still swollen from my mother's slap, but I'm smiling, really smiling, because even in that moment of crisis, I had everything that mattered. A partner who protected me, friends who supported me, and finally the beginning of my own authentic story. Our new apartment in San Diego overlooks the Pacific Ocean, and some mornings I stand at the window watching the sunrise and thinking about the woman I've become. I'm Dr. Cassandra Whitfield now, not because my mother sacrificed for my success, but because I worked for it, earned it, and surrounded myself with people who wanted to see me thrive. Sometimes people ask if I missed having a mother. The answer is complicated. I miss the mother I thought she was when I was a child, before I understood that her love was always conditional on my usefulness to her image. But I don't miss the woman she actually was, the one who saw my achievements as proof of her superiority and my independence as a personal attack. I've learned that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who celebrate your successes without taking credit, who support your dreams without demanding gratitude, and who love you for who you are rather than what you can do for them.
James and I are planning our own family now, and sometimes I wonder what kind of mother I'll be. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. My children will never have to earn my love, and their achievements will belong to them alone. The best revenge against a narcissistic parent isn't destroying their life. It's building a life so authentic and fulfilling that their opinion becomes irrelevant. It's teaching your own children that love isn't transactional, success isn't measured by someone else's approval, and sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to see your worth. I'm not Diane Castellano's daughter anymore. I'm just Cassandra, and that's enough. If this story resonated with you, I want you to know that you're not alone. Millions of people are recovering from narcissistic family abuse, and healing is possible. Trust your reality. Document everything. Find professional support. And remember, you don't owe anyone access to your life, not even family. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself from people who see you as a commodity rather than a person. What's the bravest thing you've ever done to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments. And remember to subscribe for more stories about choosing yourself when no one else will.